Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive in, make sure you drop your thoughts and the lessons you took from this story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. My name is Lena Brooks, and on an ordinary gray morning in Seattle, I learned exactly how invisible I had become in my own marriage. At 6:15 in the morning, I woke to the sound of drawers opening and closing. For a few seconds I thought I was dreaming, but the sharp rattle of hangers and the muffled zip of a suitcase pulled me fully awake. I turned toward the closet and saw my husband, Terrell, standing there in a t-shirt and slacks, packing with the kind of focused urgency people usually reserve for emergencies, not for Tuesday mornings. My voice came out rough and sleepy as I pushed myself up on my elbows. I asked what he was doing, still trying to understand why the day felt wrong before it even began. He did not look at me when he answered. He said he needed space, and that he was going to stay with his friend, Antoine, for a few days. He said it in that careful, rehearsed tone people use when they want to sound calm, as if a measured voice can soften the impact of what they are really saying. I felt my throat tighten. I asked what space meant, and if something had happened that he had not told me about. He hesitated for a heartbeat, then kept folding shirts and said that his friends had been asking why he was with someone who lacked ambition, someone who was not impressive, someone who was, in their words, not remarkable enough for him. He finally glanced at me then, almost apologetically, and added that he did not necessarily agree with everything they said, but it had made him think. He said it gently, as if that softness could disguise the weight of it. I felt the sentence hit me in slow motion, each word landing with a dull thud in my chest. 7 years of marriage reduced to one evaluation, not remarkable enough. A quiet wife who worked from home. A woman who, in his eyes, blended into the background. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and sat up, my feet cold on the hardwood floor, trying to keep my voice steady. I asked if this was truly what he believed, or if he was just repeating what his friends had said to him when I was not around. He shrugged as if the distinction did not matter and mentioned Serena, a woman I had never even met in person, only heard about in passing. He said she had looked him straight in the eye at a dinner party and told him he was too accomplished to stay with someone like me. He repeated it as though her opinion carried the authority of a performance review, as if the life we had built together weighed less than a casual remark from across a restaurant table. I pictured them seated around some polished bar, my name a subject passed between people who had never once asked to know me. Terrell continued packing while I continued watching, feeling something fall apart inside me that I had never fully named. He paused at the foot of the bed, waiting, I think, for tears or for me to argue or beg. Instead, I heard myself speak quietly. I told him that before he left, there was something he needed to hear. Something about the work I had been doing. Something he had never once asked about. He exhaled heavily, thinking I was trying to delay him, then sat on the edge of the dresser and rubbed his temples. He asked if this could wait until things calmed down. I looked at him and said no. I said I was not trying to stop him. I was reclaiming space that had never been offered to me. Space he did not even know he had taken. Then I said it calmly, as if I were making a simple observation. I told him, "Terrell, you never asked who I really am. If you had asked anyone who knew us before that morning, they would have said Terrell and I were a steady couple. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just reliably stable in the way people assume a long marriage should be." We met 9 years earlier in a small coffee shop in Portland. The tables were crowded with students and freelancers, the air thick with the scent of espresso and burnt sugar. Terrell sat at the corner table, rolled up blueprints spread out in front of him, a mechanical pencil balanced behind his ear. He was an architectural intern then, full of big dreams and an even bigger belief in what his future could look like. I had my own laptop open, juggling multiple consulting projects and trying to convince myself that the patchwork of contracts I had collected would someday turn into direction. He approached my table after noticing that I kept glancing at his sketches. He smiled, a little shy, and asked if I could help him choose between 2 design options for a community center lobby. We ended up talking for almost 2 hours. He spoke about buildings as if they were living things, as if steel and glass could breathe. His eyes lit up when he described how light moved through atriums and how people felt in spaces that truly worked. I admired that fire in him. I wanted him to reach those imagined places, and from the beginning, I never hesitated to encourage him. Our early years were filled with late-night brainstorming sessions over takeout noodles and coffee reheated too many times. When rent came due during the first year of his unpaid internships, I was the one who covered it. I told myself this was what partnership looked like. When he spent entire weekends drafting proposals for firms that barely remembered his name, I brought him food and gently pried his tense fingers away from the keyboard long enough for him to stretch. He would kiss my forehead and tell me he did not know what he would do without me. I believed him. I believed we were building something together. His path and mine woven side by side, our futures forming a single fabric. Slowly, in ways that were almost invisible at first, the dynamic shifted. Terrell began to define success only in terms of titles and public recognition. If something could not be posted, announced, or proudly claimed at work events, he did not see its value. His world became a series of milestones he could point to: promotions, big pitches, the number of people in a conference room when he presented. My world did not work that way. Much of my consulting work required confidentiality, clients who wanted solutions without their problems being exposed. Because there were no public announcements, he assumed what I did was small, ordinary background noise compared to his polished presentations and project launches. He stopped asking what my days looked like. At first he would say, "How did your calls go?" while loosening his tie, but when I gave answers he did not understand, his eyes would drift back to his phone. Over time, the question disappeared entirely. I became the reliable one in the background, the person who made sure the bills were paid and the fridge was stocked, the one who handled repairs when something broke and called his mother when he forgot her birthday. When his job became stressful, I became the soft surface he landed on, and because I loved him, I allowed myself to fade a little at a time. Looking back, I see the quiet danger of women like me in marriages like the one I was in. We shrink to make room for someone else's greatness, convinced that love is measured by how little space we take up. We smooth the edges, quiet our ambitions, and tell ourselves that one day we will step forward again, when things are less busy, when our partner feels more secure. But that day does not come. Instead, one morning you wake up and realize there is nothing left of you but a shadow standing beside a man who stopped looking long ago. The part Terrell never saw, the part he never even thought to ask about, was the life I had been building quietly beside him. Not behind his back, not out of deceit, but in silence. I learned early that he only valued what he could measure in obvious ways: titles, salaries, awards, applause. There was always a number attached to his pride. My world was made of quieter metrics: crisis averted before anyone noticed, reputations preserved, companies stabilized. Somewhere along the way, I stopped offering explanations he did not ask for. It felt easier to let him cling to his small story about me than to force him to confront a truth he was not ready to see. 3 years before that suitcase morning, my closest friend from college, Naomi Price, called me out of the blue. We had been roommates our freshman year, two young women who bonded over late-night study sessions, cheap instant noodles, and whispered conversations about how we would someday do something that mattered. Naomi was working as a cybersecurity analyst by then, brilliant in a way that made companies nervous until they realized how much they needed her. When I picked up, she skipped past small talk. She said she had an idea and needed me to hear it with an open mind. We scheduled a video call that evening. Terrell was working late, so I sat at the dining table with my laptop, screen glow bouncing off the glass of water beside me. Naomi leaned toward her camera, eyes bright with the kind of excitement I had not felt in myself for a long time. She said the tech world was full of disasters waiting to happen: data breaches, internal scandals, executives making reckless decisions that could implode entire companies overnight. She believed there was space for a small, precise team that could step in when everything fell apart, a firm companies could call when they needed quiet, effective damage control. "I can handle the technical forensics," Naomi said, tapping her pen against her notebook. "But I need someone who understands people, strategy, messaging, the kind of person who can walk into a boardroom full of panic and make them listen. That is you, Lena. You have always been that person." I laughed at first, not because I thought she was wrong, but because I had not heard anyone describe me that way in a long time. I asked if she was sure she wanted to leave the safety of a full-time job. She asked if I was sure I was content spending my life making everyone else's dreams easier while pretending I did not have any of my own. After the call ended, I sat on the couch while Terrell came home and talked for 40 minutes straight about a new project at his firm. I listened, nodding and smiling in the familiar rhythm of my role, proud of how energized he sounded. But inside, something shifted. For the first time in years, I felt my own pulse, my own ambition stretching awake after a long sleep. When he asked casually, "So how was your day?" and then picked up his phone before I could answer. The decision settled in my chest. I would not let my life pass entirely in the background. Naomi and I launched Brooks Price Strategies with no fancy office, no sleek branding, and no public announcement. Our headquarters were the dining table in my apartment and the spare bedroom in hers. Our first clients came through hushed referrals. A mid-sized software company scrambling to contain a data leak, a startup whose co-founder had been caught misusing customer information, a regional provider quietly hit by ransomware. We worked 12-hour days guiding executives through damage control, rewriting internal policies, and coordinating behind-the-scenes negotiations. Our invoices were high. Our results were fast. Our confidentiality was absolute. In our first year, we cleared $300,000. By year 2, we approached $1 million. By year 3, companies were calling us before they called their boards. There were nights when I sat on the floor with my laptop propped against the couch, talking a chief executive officer through a crisis while Terrell slept in the next room, assuming I was dealing with small freelance tasks. He never paused to ask why my client calls sometimes ran past midnight or why I took meetings during what he thought were my free hours. When I upgraded equipment or quietly covered an unexpected expense, he accepted it without question, as if money simply appeared when he needed it. He did not ask because he had already decided which category I belonged in. In his mind, I was the steady spouse, the calm background, the woman who kept things running while he chased visible success. And I stayed silent because sometimes it truly is easier to let someone believe a small story than to drag them into a larger truth that will scare them. I told myself I would explain it all one day. When the time was right, when the deals were solid, when I felt sure he could handle the reality of my success. That day kept moving further away. 6 months before that morning in Seattle, Naomi and I were already deep into several high-profile crisis cases when we were approached by representatives from 2 major corporations. Both were well-known names in the tech world, the kind that appear in headlines weekly and whose executives speak on main stages at global conferences. They wanted to buy our firm. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. We had no public profile, no glossy marketing, not even a proper website. But that was precisely what made us attractive. We operated in the shadows, fixing disasters before the public ever knew a problem existed. To companies drowning in controversy, that kind of invisible efficiency was worth millions. The offers came with non-disclosure requirements so strict that even mentioning them to Terrell would have violated the agreements. Naomi and I spent weeks reviewing contracts, meeting with attorneys, and calculating the long-term consequences of selling. We argued over numbers, over who would retain control, over whether we were ready to give up independence in exchange for security and reach. More than once, Naomi asked me if I had talked to Terrell about any of it. I hesitated every time. I said I would once things became more concrete, once the documents were finalized. Underneath that explanation was a deeper truth. I knew Terrell. I knew how he measured himself against the world. I knew how threatened he would feel discovering that his quiet wife was building something bigger than anything he had dared to imagine for himself. Eventually, one offer stood out from the rest. A buyout worth $18.5 million with a provision that Naomi and I would stay on as executive partners with full operational control. My share would be $11.2 million. When the final documents arrived for signature, I sat at my desk staring at my name on the contract, feeling both proud and terrified. Proud of what we had built, terrified of what it might do to a marriage already resting on uneven ground. That night, Terrell came home angry about a design pitch that had been rejected. He dropped his bag by the door and paced the living room, venting about senior partners who did not recognize his potential and clients who did not appreciate his ideas. I listened without interrupting, hands folded in my lap, the unsigned contract lying half-tucked under my notebook on the coffee table. At one point he sat down beside me, rubbed his face, and said, "Sometimes I feel like I am the only one around here pushing for more." He never glanced at the stack of papers between us. He never asked how my day had gone. My fingers trembled slightly against my knees, but I kept them still until he went to bed. I signed the acquisition papers the next morning while Terrell was at work. My hand steadied with each signature. With every page I initialed, I felt as though I were stepping into a future that finally belonged entirely to me. When the last document was scanned and sent off, I sat back in my chair and exhaled, my heart pounding hard but steady. I did not yet know how quickly that future would collide with a man who had never truly seen me at all. After Terrell walked out that morning with his suitcase, the initial shock in my chest cooled into something else. Not anger and not heartbreak, at least not in the way I expected. It was clarity. For the first time, I fully understood that the version of me he had loved was a quiet outline, a supporting character whose job was to make his world smoother. The moment he decided I was not remarkable enough, he was willing to reconsider the entire foundation of our marriage. That realization hardened something inside me that had been soft for too long. The first thing I did after the front door closed was call Naomi. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert even though it was early. I told her what had happened, the comments about his friends, the suitcase, the words "not remarkable enough" echoing in the room. She was silent for a moment, then asked me to repeat exactly what he had said about me. When I finished, she inhaled slowly. She asked, "What do you want to do now, Lena?" Not, "Are you all right?" Not, "Can you fix this?" Just that one question. I stared at the half-packed drawer he had left open and realized this was the first time in years anyone had asked me what I wanted separate from what I could hold together. I told her I wanted out. Not with a dramatic scene, not with broken dishes or shouting, but with precision. I wanted to leave in a way that reflected who I had become, not who he thought I was. Naomi said, "Then we do this correctly. You protect what you built, and you walk away with your head high." She gave me the name of an attorney she trusted, a woman known for handling complex financial separations and never underestimating a quiet client. I wrote the name down carefully, Attorney Rochelle Hayes. I met Rochelle 2 days later in a downtown office that overlooked the city. Her conference room was bright and orderly, shelves neatly lined with casebooks and framed degrees. She was composed, with an expression that suggested she had seen every kind of mess and did not scare easily. I handed her the folders I had brought: contracts, invoices, bank statements, email chains, acquisition documents. She read in silence, a pen resting loosely between her fingers. Every so often she underlined a sentence or nodded faintly as she turned a page. When she finally looked up, her gaze was steady. She said I had protected myself far better than most people did, even without realizing it. I had kept the business accounts separate, maintained detailed records, and never commingled company assets with our personal ones. It meant that in a divorce, my ownership of Brooks Price Strategies and the acquisition payout would be very difficult to challenge. Rochelle tilted her head slightly and asked how my husband had reacted to the sale. I told her he did not know. One of her eyebrows lifted, but she did not judge. She only said, "You are allowed to build a life he chose not to see." She explained my options clearly, outlining how property division would likely work, what I could expect legally, and what would happen if Terrell tried to claim part of the company's value. Then she folded her hands and said, "You do not owe him an explanation for being extraordinary. But if you want closure, we can plan how and when you tell your story." Her words settled over me with surprising comfort. For the first time, I felt not like a woman hiding something, but like a woman holding something I had earned. There was one last piece of our shared life that I was not ready to walk away from without addressing. Terrell's birthday was in 10 days. Months earlier, when our marriage still felt reparable, I had reserved a private dining room at an upscale restaurant overlooking the water. It was supposed to be a surprise celebration, just the two of us, a quiet evening to remind us why we had chosen each other. Now it would be something else entirely. I changed the reservation from a table for 2 to a table for 12. I invited the people whose opinions Terrell valued more than he valued honesty with me. Antoine, his longtime friend from his firm. Dante, who had known him since college. Sierra, whose approval he always tried to earn. And Serena, the woman who had told him he was too accomplished to stay with me. I was not seeking a dramatic confrontation. I wanted clarity. I wanted them to see the version of me Terrell had never bothered to learn, and I wanted him to understand, quietly and undeniably, that my invisibility had been his choice, not my reality. On the afternoon of the dinner, Naomi met me at my apartment. She helped me double-check the slide deck I had prepared. The history of Brooks Price Strategies, anonymized case summaries, revenue charts, the acquisition details, and a few carefully selected bank statements that showed the quiet ways I had supported Terrell over the years. We went through each slide one more time. Naomi asked if I was sure I wanted to do it in front of his friends. I said yes. I told her I needed him to see himself through the eyes of the people he had tried so hard to impress. She studied my face, then nodded and squeezed my hand. "Then walk in there as the woman you are now," she said. "Not the one he kept in his shadow." The night of Terrell's birthday arrived with an early spring chill. The sky over Seattle was a soft pale blue fading into dusk, the kind of evening that makes the city glow against the water. The private dining room the restaurant had set aside for us was warm, lined with soft lighting and tall windows overlooking the waterfront. A long table sat in the center, set with polished silverware and deep blue napkins folded with precise, crisp corners. In the corner of the room, the small projector and screen I had requested stood ready. The staff had asked no questions when I requested the equipment. They simply prepared the space exactly as I had described. I arrived 15 minutes early. Standing alone in that quiet room, I felt the weight of what I was about to do, but there was no tremor in my hands. I straightened the place cards, adjusted the projector remote on the table, and took a slow breath. One by one, Terrell's friends began to arrive. Sierra walked in first, wearing a tailored dress and a carefully neutral expression. She greeted me politely, a hint of confusion flickering in her eyes when she saw the size of the table. Antoine arrived next, clapping me lightly on the shoulder and making a joke about me outdoing myself. Dante followed, giving me an uncertain half-smile. Serena entered last, her gaze sharp, quickly cataloging the room. They all believed the dinner was simply a celebration for Terrell, hosted by the supportive wife they thought they knew. They chatted about work, traffic, and the restaurant's reputation, but each glance they sent toward the projector was threaded with curiosity. When Terrell finally stepped into the room, he froze. He had not spoken to me since the morning he packed his suitcase. His eyes moved from me, to the table full of people, to the screen in the corner. The muscles in his jaw tightened. I gestured to the empty seat at the head of the table. After a moment, he walked over and sat down carefully, like a person lowering himself into unknown water. Dinner began quietly. The clinking of glasses, the low murmur of conversation, the soft footsteps of servers entering and leaving. Terrell tried to act composed, raising his glass when someone toasted his birthday, but the stiffness in his shoulders betrayed him. He kept glancing toward the projector and then back to me, waiting for an explanation I did not yet offer. Antoine tried to lighten the mood with a story from work, and Sierra asked polite questions about how I had been, clearly unsure how much she was allowed to acknowledge the tension in the room. Halfway through the meal, when plates were being cleared and the conversation had collapsed into uneasy small talk, I stood up. My chair scraped lightly against the floor. The room went quiet. I thanked everyone for coming, my voice clear and steady. I said I knew this was not the kind of celebration they were expecting, but there were things I needed to share, and I wanted the people who influenced Terrell's view of our marriage to hear them as well. Serena's eyes narrowed slightly. Dante folded his arms. Terrell looked at me with a mixture of irritation and apprehension. I walked to the projector and pressed the remote. The first slide appeared, simple white text on a dark background. Brooks Price Strategies, Crisis Management and Corporate Restoration. For a moment, no one reacted. Then Antoine frowned slightly. I did not know you had a company, he said quietly. I nodded and explained that for the past 3 years, I had co-founded and run this firm with my business partner Naomi. I described in precise, measured terms how we handled large-scale corporate crises for technology companies across the country. Because our work demanded absolute confidentiality, I explained, I rarely spoke about it publicly. I clicked to the next slide. The screen showed revenue charts rising year over year, anonymized summaries of crises we had navigated, brief references to reputations we had helped restore. I did not reveal names, only patterns. I could feel the room leaning toward the screen, minds reassembling what they thought they knew about my days. Then I went to the slide that changed everything. The acquisition contract appeared, the key figures highlighted. Total amount $18,500,000. My share, $11,200,000. The silence thickened. Sierra covered her mouth with her hand, as if the number had pushed the air from her lungs. Antoine blinked several times, his gaze moving between the screen and my face. Dante let out a soft exhale, his earlier skepticism dissolving into shock. Terrell stared at the numbers, his expression blank, as if his mind had shut down rather than accept what he was seeing. I continued speaking evenly. I explained that the transfer had been completed 3 weeks earlier, that Naomi and I had stayed on as executive partners with full operational control. There was no pride in my tone, only fact. Then I changed to the next slide. Bank statements appeared. Payment transfers. Line items documenting the quiet financial contributions I had made over the years. I pointed to them one by one. The months I covered rent during his unpaid internships, the networking events I paid for when he said he could not afford the tickets, the equipment he bought with money I had transferred when his account balance could not stretch any further, the gaps I filled when his workload slowed and his paychecks dipped. I looked directly at Terrell. My voice did not rise. I never kept score, I said, but you did. You measured my worth by how loud my ambitions sounded, not by what they accomplished. For a long moment, no one spoke. Terrell's face tightened, but he did not protest. I could almost see him replaying every conversation we had ever had about money, every offhand comment he had made about being the primary provider. Finally, I said the words that had sat, heavy and unsaid, in my chest for too long. You told your friends I was not remarkable, I said. You let someone you barely know say I was not enough for you, and you repeated it like it was a fact. The truth is, Terrell, you never looked closely enough to see who I really was. I did not add anything else. There was nothing left to explain. I closed the presentation gently, not with triumph, but with release. Then I looked around the table and thanked everyone for coming. I said to Terrell, "This dinner is my final gift to you. A clear picture, no arguments, no secrets, just the truth you never asked for." I picked up my coat from the back of my chair and slipped it on, my movements calm and unhurried. No one tried to stop me. As I walked toward the door, the only sound behind me was the quiet hum of the projector shutting down and the soft clink of a wine glass against a plate as someone's hand trembled. The next morning, I woke to a quiet apartment. It was not the heavy silence of tension, but a clean, almost fragile stillness, like the air after a storm has finally moved on. I made coffee and sat by the kitchen window, watching the early light stretch across the city. For the first time in years, I felt a calm inside my chest that was not numbness. It was clarity. A door had closed, and it had closed without slamming. My phone buzzed at 8:30. A message from Serena. Then another from Sierra. Then a missed call from Antoine. I ignored them at first, unwilling to be pulled back into explanations or reassurances. At 10, Serena called again. This time I answered. Her voice shook the moment I said hello. She said she needed to apologize. She sounded nothing like the confident woman who had once told Terrell he was too accomplished to stay with someone like me. Serena told me that after I left the restaurant, the group sat in stunned silence for nearly 20 minutes. No one knew what to say. Eventually they moved outside, where the cold air made it harder to avoid what they had just seen. Antoine demanded to know why Terrell had never mentioned the work I did. Dante asked how he could claim to be the primary provider when I had quietly filled the financial gaps for years. Sierra, who rarely showed emotion, told him that partner or not, he owed me respect. Serena said that when they pressed him, Terrell broke down on the sidewalk, not out of regret for how he had treated me, but because the image he had carefully built in front of them had shattered. It was like he only realized your worth when he saw how small it made him look for ignoring it, Serena whispered. There was no defense in her tone anymore, only honesty. I listened, then thanked her for telling me. I told her I did not hold on to resentment, but I also did not need any of them to defend me now. That part of my life had already ended. When we hung up, I set my phone down and let the quiet fill the room again. It no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like space. Later that afternoon, the first article about the acquisition went live. It was a simple piece in a business journal, factual and understated, detailing how a discreet crisis management firm, Brooks Price Strategies, had been quietly acquired by a larger corporate group. Within hours, the story was shared across professional networks, reposted in industry groups, and circulated among executives who had known our work but never known our names. Messages began to pour in. Former clients congratulated us. Strangers in the industry sent notes saying they had heard whispers of our firm for years and were glad to finally put names to the reputation. Invitations followed. Podcasts asked if I would speak about building a company under the radar. Panels wanted me to join discussions on leadership, crisis management, and the quiet power of behind-the-scenes work. At first, I hesitated. I had spent years operating in silence, and the idea of stepping into a public space felt foreign, almost like wearing someone else's clothes. But Naomi reminded me that telling our story did not mean giving away our methods. It meant claiming the space we had already earned. The first time I sat across from a podcast host in a small studio, headphones covering my ears and a microphone inches from my mouth, I felt my heart pounding, but my voice did not waver. We talked about risk, about the early days when our office was a laptop propped on a stack of cookbooks. We talked about the delicate art of walking into a room full of executives in crisis and becoming the calm center they did not know they needed. At one point, the host asked a question that rooted itself in my mind. She said, "You were building all of this while your marriage was falling apart. Why did you stay so quiet at home for so long?" The question lingered in the air. I could have given a simple answer, something about non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality, but that would have been only part of the truth. Instead, I took a breath and said that it was not silence born only of fear. It was silence born of habit. When you are consistently told, directly or indirectly, that your story is secondary, you start to believe it. You shrink your voice to make room for someone else's. You accept that your role is to support, not to be seen. By the time you realize what has happened, the quiet feels normal, even when it is slowly erasing you. The interview resonated more than I expected. Messages flooded my inbox from people who had spent years folding themselves into smaller shapes so others could shine. Some wrote that they had abandoned dreams because their partners dismissed them or made jokes whenever they expressed ambition. Others said they had lost themselves in marriages that praised their support but never acknowledged their strength. Reading those messages humbled me. They reminded me that my story was not just about a failing marriage or a large acquisition. It was about all the ways people disappear inside relationships, workplaces, and families, and the quiet, powerful act of stepping back into the light. Amid all of this, the work itself did not slow down. Under its new ownership, Brooks Price Strategies expanded. New teams were hired. New offices opened in other cities. Naomi and I spent time training new leaders, building structures that would allow our methods to scale without losing their precision. The day we walked into the renovated office the parent company had prepared for us in Seattle, 2 full floors of glass and steel and carefully designed meeting spaces, I stopped for a moment in the lobby. Our logo was etched into the glass doors. Seeing my name there, Brooks, sent a sharp wave of emotion through me. It was a visible confirmation of something I had always known deep down but seldom allowed myself to acknowledge. I was capable of building something extraordinary. Terrell tried to reach out again. The first message came a month after the dinner, short, stumbling through an apology for how everything unfolded. Then another arrived, longer, full of explanations about stress, insecurity, and the pressure he felt to live up to the image his friends had of him. He said he had been wrong. He said he had allowed his ego to blind him. It was not lost on me that his revelation came only after my success had become public. His final email said he hoped we could meet for coffee, that he wanted closure, that he wanted to see if there was anything left to salvage. I read that message once slowly. Then I closed the laptop. I did not respond. It was not an act of spite. It was a simple recognition that there was nothing left between us that could be repaired. The silence between us was no longer a wound. It was distance, neutral, necessary, and final. The woman who had sat quietly on the edge of the bed while he packed a suitcase was gone. In her place stood someone who understood her own value and did not need his belated recognition to validate it. A few months later, I spoke at a leadership conference in a large hotel ballroom. The room was filled with women from different industries: finance, technology, healthcare, education. They listened as I talked about crisis management, about building trust when everything is falling apart, about the difference between titles and actual influence. I told parts of my story without lingering on the details of my marriage, focusing instead on what it meant to step out of the background of your own life. After my talk, during the question and answer segment, someone in the audience stood up and asked a question that settled quietly inside me. She asked how I knew it was time to walk away. The room fell silent again. Hundreds of faces turned toward me. I answered honestly. I said that I realized a relationship should make you larger, not smaller. That love, in its healthiest form, expands your world instead of compressing it. I said the moment you notice yourself disappearing just to keep the peace, something essential has already broken, whether you admit it aloud or not. When the event ended, dozens of people lined up to speak with me. They shared fragments of their own stories. Demanding jobs, dismissive partners, families that only celebrated visible achievements while ignoring quiet strength. I listened, grateful and humbled, reminded again that invisibility is rarely chosen knowingly. It is learned, reinforced each time someone tells you that you are supportive, but never names you as strong. The beauty, I told one woman softly as she wiped away a tear, is that what is learned can also be unlearned. In the months that followed, My life settled into a rhythm that felt both unfamiliar and deeply right. Work was busy but grounded. I had clear boundaries for when I closed my laptop and stepped away from the noise. I moved into a new apartment overlooking Lake Union, a space filled with morning light and quiet corners where I could read, think, or simply sit with myself without the constant pressure of someone else's expectations pressing in from every side. It was the first home I had chosen entirely for me, with no need to compromise on what someone else preferred. I filled the space slowly. A bookshelf in the living room. A small plant in the kitchen that I remembered to water more often than I expected. Artwork from local galleries that made me pause and breathe when I walked past. I hosted Naomi for dinner, just the two of us, talking about everything from upcoming projects to childhood memories that still made us laugh. There was no performance in those evenings, no silent role I was expected to play. I showed up as my whole self, and that was enough. One Saturday morning, I walked along the waterfront with a paper cup of tea warming my hands. Boats drifted lazily across the lake, and the city moved at an unhurried pace around me. The air was cool, the sun gentle, the sound of water lapping against the shore steady and comforting. For the first time in a very long time, I felt completely present. I was not rehearsing arguments in my head. I was not shrinking myself to fit someone else's comfort. I was not questioning whether my worth depended on anyone's approval. As I walked, I thought about the version of myself from a year earlier. The woman who apologized for taking up space in her own marriage, who dimmed her accomplishments to avoid making her partner feel insecure, who sat silently while others defined her in conversations she was not even present for. I wished, briefly, that I could reach back through time and wrap my arms around her. I would tell her she had never been the problem. She had never been too quiet or too gentle or too unremarkable. She had simply been unrecognized by someone who lacked the depth to truly see her. Standing at the edge of the water, I watched the sun catch the surface of the lake, turning it into shifting bands of light. I understood, in a way that went beyond words, that I would never again try to convince someone to value me. I would not perform my way into being seen or contort myself to fit inside someone else's narrow idea of what was worthy. I had stepped out of the shadows once, and I had no intention of returning. I took a slow breath, feeling the air fill my lungs, feeling my feet steady on the ground. My life was not perfect. There were still difficult days and complicated decisions. But every choice I made now was rooted in a clear truth. I did not have to disappear for anyone. I did not have to fold myself smaller to make space for someone else's ego. I had built something real, with my mind, my work, my will, and I had walked away from a marriage that could not hold the full weight of who I truly was. I turned away from the water and started back toward my apartment, the city opening up in front of me. My steps were unhurried. My shoulders were no longer curved inward. There was no performance in the way I carried myself, no silent question asking whether I was allowed to take up the ground I walked on. I had answered that question for myself. I was here. I was visible. And I was no longer waiting for anyone else to decide whether that was remarkable enough. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.